I will forget. One more minute. Before we get started, I'll remind everybody, please, 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 if you have a question, whenever you have a question, just pop it in the chat or the Q&A. I'll look during the class at both locations, but it can be very much whenever you think of the question, and then I'll try to weave them in the right time, or we'll answer them all at the end. And we will always stay later and answer your question. So let's get officially started. Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. My name is Curry Sautner, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at the National Constitution Center. And today's class is all about elections and voting rights. So we have a lot to cover in 30 minutes, but we love questions. So make sure you ask them, because if you ask it, we're probably all thinking that same question. So it's great to share what you're wondering and what you want to know and what you need clarification on. Now, to walk us through this class, I am so glad I am not alone. I'm with our Chief Content Officer, Tom Donnelly. Tom, do you want to say hello to everybody?
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Can't wait to talk about elections and voting rights.
Awesome. So let's dive in, because there is a lot to cover in this conversation. Tom, thought it would be fun to like a little current events moment and talk about when the elections are happening in our country this year and what are the big races to watch for. So, you know, we always tend to talk about elections when there's a presidential election, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. But in reality, there's elections every single year in November. So want to kind of walk us through what are the races to watch this year?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, this is it's 2022, so it's what's known as a midterm election. So if we're looking at the national elections in the country, as always, every 2 years, every seat in the House of Representatives is up for election. So that's written into the Constitution. Every 2 years, the entire House is up for election. And then 1/3 of the Senate is also up for election. That is also written into the Constitution. And so there are really big Senate races in states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada, New Hampshire. At the same time, there are a bunch of governor's races also up in the country. I think there are 36 state governor's races. So not every governor's race, but in most of the states, there is a race for governor. That particular, those sorts of laws, they're set at the state level. And so the questions of which years the governor's races are going to be, that's set by state law. And some of the big gubernatorial races are Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Kansas, Florida, Michigan. And so again, we see sort of the Constitution writing certain rules for what's going to happen for the House and the Senate, and the states being left to determine for themselves when their governor's race is going to be up.
Awesome. And I'm in Pennsylvania, and you can definitely tell there's a big governor's race going on. I don't know if my Philly classmates can see that as well, but there's lots of lawn signs. That's when you know it's like a heated race, because there's millions of lawn signs everywhere. They almost seem like they're in battle with each other, depending on which street you're going down. So there's a whole bunch of questions that we're going to cover today. And I just wanted to lay out the agenda for our students of what we're going to do, so you can make sure you can kind of see the forest for the trees. First, I thought we'd talk about, and you already started, Tom, so thank you, the constitutional framework for elections in the Constitution in the United States, and then really address the Electoral College, because that's the key thing that so often people talk about when they talk about big elections, especially the presidential election, and then the modern debates over the Electoral College. So we'll work through that, what's in the Constitution on elections, and then the big thing in the presidential elections, Electoral College. And then we're going to go do the same thing again. We're going to go back to the Constitution, look at voting rights in the Constitution. So how somebody becomes a representative of our country, the election, and then who gets to vote for those people that become our representatives. It's kind of the way that we're going to break today's class down. And we're going to go through the 15th, the 19th, the 23rd, 24th, and 26th Amendment, probably dabble a few other amendments in there. I'm sure the 12th will be talked about. And then we'll talk about current debates on voting rights that you should keep an eye out for in the court or in the news. So a lot to cover in a short period of time. Shall we start with the elections and where they are in the Constitution, Tom?
Of course, let's start always as we do with the Constitution's text. If we look at the original Constitution, there are really 4 big spots where we address voting. And so the first one is Article 1, Section 2, which sets out the qualifications for voters in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so it matches the qualifications for voters for the lower house of each legislature. So it's voters voting for who's in the House of Representatives for its day. This is a fairly democratic provision, requiring states to elect national representatives with the same rules that apply to the most democratic part of their state government, its lower house. And so it's Article 1, Section 2. The next is Article 1, Section 3, which defines how we elect U.S. senators, which under the original Constitution, we elected U.S. senators not through voters, but through the state legislatures. We later changed this with the 17th Amendment. Then we have Article 1, Section 4, which leaves the time, place, and manner of elections to the state legislatures, but subject to regulation by Congress. This is a reminder right there in the Constitution itself that states are going to play a key role when it comes to elections and voting. And finally, Article 2, Section 1 sets up the Electoral College. There are two big takeaways here, Curry. One is that the original Constitution leaves elections and voting largely to the states. So it really is. It ends up being a question, really, a story of federalism, of state power. That's why things like state governors, state legislators, mayors, county legislatures, town councils, all of them, they happen at different times, at different places. At the same time, and so you have that one part, but at the same time, you also have different timetables for different parts of the national government, which we talked about at the beginning. The president's elected every 4 years. The entire U.S. House is elected every 2 years, so it's a lot shorter. And then 1/3 of the Senate is up every 2 years, which senators serving for 6-year terms. And those rules are written into the Constitution itself.
Has there ever been a time where the entire House changed over, or the higher? It just seems a little dangerous to have an entire part of our government possibly be able to switch out. I mean, I'm sure it's never happened, but I get why they would do it for senators, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That feels like a healthy mix of new or possibly new. But what do you think the highest ever of the House turnover has been?
I don't know, but in the end, this was part of the vision, the idea that these different institutions were going to be responsive to the people in different ways, and that the U.S. House was going to be closest to the people. As Madison said, the House would be dependent on the people alone. So the founders were more comfortable with there being churn at that level of government, and we'd have some stability in the Senate and with the presidency.
Awesome. Thank you. The why is always really helpful too. Now, when we talk about elections in the country, and there's a case in the Supreme Court right now on, is it on the election process or the voting process, the big case to watch this year?
Well, there are two big ones. They both have to do with districting largely, and so the drawing of legislative districts. One of them is, which actually was argued this morning, which is called Merrill versus Milligan, has to do with election districts in Alabama and the role of race in the redistricting process. And the other case is called Moore versus Harper, which hasn't been scheduled yet, but it has to do with the drawing of legislative maps in North Carolina and the role of state courts in policing what are known as partisan gerrymanders. And so these are efforts, these are challenges brought to state legislative maps, saying that the legislatures have drawn those maps in a way that benefits one party over the other. The federal courts have said we're not getting into those questions, but state courts can. And the question is, in that case, whether or not state courts under the Constitution can actually police partisan gerrymanders.
Ooh, okay. So we'll get to that more towards the end, but one of our classes brought that up, and I wanted to weave it in earlier so we could be thinking about that as we get to that. And the Electoral College, which is the way that we vote for president, I'm going to just go on a limb here. It's really confusing, Tom. It's really weird. Could you kind of walk us through what it is, why we have it, and then the debate about the pros and cons of it as well?
Sure, and I saw one question in the chat about what's the name of the Alabama case. It's Merrill versus Milligan. That's the Supreme Court case that was just argued this morning. But turning to the Electoral College, we know many democratic nations in the world elect their executives by direct popular vote, but we in the United States, we don't. Instead, we have the Electoral College. So what's that? So today, the Electoral College is made up of 538 electors drawn from states and the District of Columbia. So under the Article 2 of the Constitution, states are given a number of electors equal to the number of members of Congress that they have. So to see how many electoral votes each state has, you add up the number of people that it has in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate, and you get that number. So if you have 2 members in the House, 2 members of the Senate, you get 4 electoral votes in the Electoral College. We see here Pennsylvania, 17 plus 2 gives us 19. And the 23rd Amendment gives Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes. So today, the American people, they vote for president and vice president on election day every 4 years. But technically speaking, those votes don't directly determine the outcome of the election. Technically, the popular votes determine which electors are going to be appointed to the Electoral College in each state. And these are actual people. These are electors that meet together and vote on the president in December. They cast their votes for president and vice president. And if a candidate gets a majority of these votes in the Electoral College, they become president, even if they didn't win the popular vote nationwide. And so we've had 5 times in our history a president take office not having won the popular vote. That's 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016. And if no candidate secures a majority in the Electoral College, the election's then sent to Congress. And this actually happened. That's 1824. That's when John Quincy Adams became president. He won it in the U.S. House of Representatives. And there it's the U.S. House with the states voting as states, not as individuals. They select the president. So just thinking about the Electoral College, you would think of this as a real deliberative body today. The electors just sort of meet, cast their ballots, and go on with their business. There's not much more to it than that. But the rules for how we appoint electors, they're actually in the Constitution left to the states themselves. So that's written into the Constitution in Article 2. States determine for themselves the rules of how they're going to select electors. And today we have a rule that almost all states follow. So 48 states appoint all of their electors on a winner-take-all basis, which means that if you're a presidential candidate and you win California by a single vote, you get all 54 of the electoral votes from California. So even if it's a really close race, all electoral votes go to one candidate. But we also have 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, that award electors by congressional district and give their remaining 2 electoral votes to the statewide winner. And so there's a little experimentation there within the different states. But the big point here is that at the founding, the Electoral College, this system that we have, why do we have it? Well, in part, it was a compromise between 2 different camps. There were some founders who thought we should have members of Congress select who's president. We had some key figures like Pennsylvania's James Wilson say we should have a direct popular vote. Instead, they compromised and gave us the Electoral College, again, preserving for the states a key role in saying how we're going to determine how electors are going to be elected in each state. And the one big thing you see over time is that very quickly, almost from the very beginning, voters would have a real strong say in how the electors would be appointed. There would be a close connection between the popular vote in each state and which electors were sent to the Electoral College.
And I think it's fascinating that you have this experimentation in the states like Nebraska, where it was like the first time a few years ago you started to see those candy cane stripes on the election map of the country during a presidential election, which I was like, wait, what is that? Because, and every social studies teacher we knew said they had to throw out their map of the United States between which way each state typically went. But is this one of the reasons why one of those key court cases, does this come into play? So if they are doing it like Nebraska by district, if the districts are drawn in a partisan way, would it affect the Electoral College as well?
It could. In that context, it would then affect, because if you're drawing it by congressional district, then however the districts are drawn will also in turn affect the Electoral College down the line.
Okay, good. Just wanted to weave that court case into this. And then, because we're going to cruise along pretty quick today and then circle back around those court cases, let's talk about voting rights. So how it works is in the Constitution, but so much of it is left up to the states for their voice and agency into the process, but also experimentation. But then who can vote? Where is the right to vote in the Constitution?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Harry. So, as we already saw with the original Constitution we went through, there was no explicit right to vote written into the Constitution. And the original Constitution leaves many of these questions, again, to the states. The states play a key role in elections and voting. But over time, one of the great themes in constitutional reform over time in the United States is that we have amended the Constitution many times in ways that affect the elections and voting process. You can see this list that Curry has on the screen. It's really extraordinary. And so one of the big projects in America has been using the amendment process to continue to alter how elections and voting are going to work. We did this at really near the founding itself. The 12th Amendment was ratified in 1804, and already there, we began to tweak the Electoral College. We didn't think we got all of the mechanics right in the original Constitution. So as early as 1804, we're altering the Electoral College. And then fast forwarding to after the Civil War, we ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments, which both affect voting rights. The 14th Amendment, Section 2, provides a mechanism for penalizing states when they deny African-American men over the age of 21 access to the ballot box. This was meant to encourage the African-American right to vote when it was ratified in 1868. The Supreme Court later in the 20th century would also protect the right to vote as a fundamental right under the 14th Amendment. Importantly, with the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870, also right after the Civil War, that bans racial discrimination in voting. And then as we move ahead, we see some key amendments during the Progressive Era in the early 20th century. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, provides for the popular election of senators. So that's altering the original design. Remember, the original Constitution, US senators are selected by the state legislatures. With the 17th Amendment, we, the people, directly elect US senators. With the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, we ban gender discrimination in voting. This is the Women's Suffrage Amendment, the product of state-by-state efforts by women to push for voting rights. Eventually, we write those lessons into the Constitution itself, promising equal voting rights for women. If we fast forward ahead again to the Civil Rights era, we get the 23rd Amendment ratified in 1961. And so there it's granting the District of Columbia 3 electors in the Electoral College. So it's giving DC a voice in presidential elections. In part, this is so important because DC has a massive African-American population. So in that sense, the 23rd Amendment ends up of a piece with the civil rights movement. In the 24th Amendment then is ratified in 1964. You're right there, Curry.
I couldn't remember exactly.
Yeah, but it bans poll taxes in national elections. So this is striking at the heart of Jim Crow laws in the context of elections and is getting rid of Jim Crow discrimination in the South. And then finally, we have the 26th Amendment ratified in 1971. You're right on that one too, Curry. You don't need the exclamation points, which protects voting rights for those 18 and older. Effectively, what it does is it sets a national voting age floor at 18 years old throughout the nation. Prior to the 26th Amendment, most states set their voting ages at 21. Instead, with the 26th Amendment, we said, no, it should be 18. And in part, this is a response to the Vietnam War. Many young people who were drafted were still unable to vote. And so we said, no, that's not right. If you're willing to fight and die for your country, you should have the right to vote. The 26th Amendment was actually the fastest amendment we ever ratified. It was ratified in less than 4 months. And so in the end, again, the big idea here, if we take all of these together, is that while the original Constitution left the issue of voting largely to the states, a series of new constitutional amendments bans racial discrimination at the ballot box based on race, sex, and age. And so while the state governments still play a central role in elections today, a lot of these amendments carve out a new role for the national government to protect the vote, to protect voting rights in certain contexts.
Awesome. That was really helpful. And I couldn't remember the years, so I'm glad I got him right. A couple things. So Jamel Bowie is going to be our guest on Friday. And I was reading a New York Times article that he wrote a few years ago. And he said, voting in America isn't just, a forward progress. There's lots of ebbs and flows or lots of peaks and valleys. And that reminded me to kind of think through this. So I'm going to pick a couple different time periods before we get into the modern cases and talk about what was voting like at that moment. Because we tend to think it's just gotten better, but it's kind of like up and down and up and down. And again, it's this experimentation between the national and the states, and then ensuring that the values we believe around voting go into the Constitution with these big amendments. So let's start with like colonial period, like pre-Constitution. Who was allowed to vote, and how was it better after the Constitution, worse after the Constitution? Give us a little like a framing, and then who really loved a more direct election of the president? Because I feel like we should give him a shout out before we dive into other people.
That's right, and I love your reminder there. It's not as though it's just a smooth line of progress. I remember Alan Gelzo was at the Constitution Center talking about rights many years ago, and he said it's more of a zigzag. I mean, that's really how this history really proceeds. And so if we think about the founding generation, we're beginning with this period from 1776 up to the ratification of the new Constitution. It's an amazingly exciting period for the founding generation. They're creating new governments after declaring independence in each of the states. And so each states are left with a decision to make as to what sort of voting rules are they going to set. And if we're looking across those states writ large, the general rule is that states establish property requirements for voters, limiting voting rights to those who own property. And so if we're looking at who are voters in most of the states at the founding, it's white male property holders. So, poor whites aren't able to vote. In many states, African Americans, women not allowed to vote. The main rule is that white male landowners are the ones who are able to vote, but there are exceptions. So even as early as 1776, 1777, Vermont and Pennsylvania are getting rid of their property requirements. And Vermont itself also banned the institution of slavery already. So at that point in 1777, it gave all free people, including African Americans, the right to vote. And so in fact, if we're looking at the founding, all free native-born inhabitants, including African Americans, could vote in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey. So there are key states there where African Americans can vote at the founding. But the key rule across the nation, if you're looking for like a majority rule, it's that white male property owners are able to vote. And then finally, the other exception here is that New Jersey, my home state, in New Jersey at the founding between 1776 and 1807, women property owners, unmarried women property holders could also vote in Jersey during that period. By 1807, the New Jersey legislature said, no, we didn't like that experiment, and they go back to free white male citizens. But there is this brief moment in New Jersey where we also see women's suffrage. So I mean, that's a little bit about the colonial era there, the period before the Constitution.
Awesome. And you know, Pennsylvania and New Jersey has a little bit of a rivalry, people. So if you see me eyeball roll when Tom says that, just because of it, it's awesome. New Jersey does that. Things started to shift, at least for white males, in the chance to vote for president. And as actually, Tom, before we get there, when we talk about the founding generation writing the Constitution, who was one of the people at the convention that really said, no, we should let more and more of the people vote for president? They should have a voice and agency in the direct vote.
Yeah, the key figure calling for the direct popular election of the president was Pennsylvania's James Wilson, one of the great forgotten founders.
Just putting Pennsylvania back on the map there. But also I also want people to know that this was a conversation from the founding about who should be able to vote. And there was voices that said this should be a direct election for voting. And then we jump, fast forward to Andrew Jackson and talk about a shift in who gets to vote. It really favored white males, but not white male property owners. So can you talk a little bit about his election?
Yeah, so the age of Jacksonian democracy here, as we're getting to especially the 1830s, we see a move towards what's known as universal white male suffrage. So we see states abolishing those property requirements that we saw at the founding. So poor white men are now able to vote throughout the country. That wasn't the case at the founding. It is the case as we get into the 1830s, but we continue to see restrictions for many other groups, including women and African Americans. So for instance, by 1855, only 5 states, mostly concentrated in New England, so that's Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, had African American voting. So to be clear, that's not zero. There are still states, even before the Civil War in 1855, that have free African American men able to vote, but it's only a small number of states. The other key thing we see during this Jacksonian age is as we get to 1848, we see the first big convention about women's rights, the Seneca Falls Convention, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes a powerful manifesto known as the Declaration of Sentiments, which is literally a rewriting of the Declaration of Independence. It leads off by saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And as part of the Seneca Falls Convention, the convention itself votes on a resolution calling for 12 demands, including equal education, equal pay, property rights, and the, quote, sacred right to the elective franchise. So we see the roots of the women's suffrage movement beginning there in 1848 would eventually culminate in 1920. So many, many decades later in the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the Susan B. Anthony Amendment providing for women's suffrage.
So you have this kind of push for women's right to vote, but also, and it's broader than that, and I know we're going to dive into it even more in March, but women's equality and the fight for equality and the vote being seen as a tool to ensure that people who represent you are chosen by you. So if you want equality, you have to have voice and agency in the people who represent you and be a constituent of theirs. So we see this, struggle around the women also connected to the struggle to end slavery in America. So that moves us towards the fight for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So do you want to connect those dots around? We always talk about the 15th Amendment being that voting amendment, but really the 14th packs such a punch, and it all begins with ending slavery with the 13th Amendment.
We're fast forwarding here to after the Civil War, to the Reconstruction era. Many scholars refer to it as America's second founding. And after that period, we're setting new constitutional baselines. We ratify a series of three transformational amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th, ratified in 1865, abolishes slavery. The 14th, ratified in 1868, promises freedom and equality. And the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, bans racial discrimination in voting. And so here what we see is this brief shining moment where we really push towards something like an experiment in multiracial democracy in America. And the important thing to realize, Curry, is that for a brief period, it really works. You know, these amendments, they didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't just come out of people's brains. They were a product of decades upon decades of pushing by African Americans, saying that we demand the right to vote. We don't need protection from you. Give us the right to vote, and we will protect ourselves. So we see African Americans meeting in convention both before and after the Civil War, saying, what is it going to take for us to be equal citizens in the United States? You know, with the Civil War ending, we see African Americans voting in massive, massive numbers. We see African Americans holding office at all levels of government as U.S. senators and U.S. House members, governors and state legislators, all the way down to local positions in the government like sheriff and justices of the peace. And so with this, we really see a burgeoning of democracy throughout America. But again, we would see as the 1800s would go on and on into the 20th century, we would then see, again, this zigzag and a push away from many of these rights. And in the end, you know, the white Southerners retake control of many of the governments in the South. And in the end, through a combination of Jim Crow laws and violence, they undermined the right to vote for African Americans. And it would take, again, another push upon decades upon decades upon decades of push for the right to vote before we push back against Jim Crow and eliminate it from our law and really realize the promise of the 15th Amendment to ban racial discrimination in voting.
And it's an unbelievable, powerful story. I will just plug really quickly. There is an entire module of our course on voting rights. And there's amazing primary sources in there that we pulled to make sure you could hear the voices of these amazing African-American leaders and read their words directly about the power of the vote to ensure the power of freedom and equality, that it's not the only thing, but that it is a powerful tool that needed to be wielded and used. When we talk about the suppression of the vote, Tom, a little sidebar, random question for you, but we talked earlier, like 1855, you've got 5 states that are allowing free African-American men to vote in the state. And then we look at the suppression of the vote after the 15th Amendment. So this is 1870, after 1870. I guess the question I have for you was, any of those states, did they shift gears? Did they then suppress the vote? Because we tend to, you know, see so many of these things as a North or South battle, but we also see this suppression due to racism in the North as well. And I was just wondering if those states kept with their trajectory or pushed back too.
I don't think those states got rid of the vote, but there were, even after the Civil War, some Union states that did not grant African Americans the right to vote, so delayed that reform. The big way in which the vote's being suppressed, though, is that the national government, Congress, is requiring those southern states to allow African American men the right to vote even before the 15th Amendment. And so it's ultimately that congressional push and the 15th Amendment are giving the broad franchise to African American men. And then it's those Jim Crow laws thereafter that cause the backlash. And that's where the massive zigzag is happening. It's largely concentrated in those states when it comes to voting rights. Great.
Thank you. I wanted to just see how this is working. Now, we talk about Native Americans and the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. You briefly talked about 1920. We see women win the right to vote. So I wanted to kind of hit, and we can do that in more of a timeline order. We can do women first and then 1924 and Native Americans. But after the 15th Amendment and this pushback of African-American voting rights, you definitely see a split in the alignment between women's fight for the vote and suffrage and African-American voting rights. And when we see the 19th Amendment being passed, we don't see it being passed for all women. We see it for being passed for white women. So could you talk a little bit about that? And then we'll roll into the Indian Citizenship Act. Sorry,
Sure.
I zigzagged on you.
Yeah, so sure. So, I mean, prior to the Civil War, we see women and African Americans often joining together in the cause of abolitionism, anti-slavery, pushing against slavery. During the beginning of Reconstruction, we see allies with women and African Americans, both pushing for universal rights. The idea that Reconstruction is going to be about voting rights for everyone, but ultimately what we see with the 15th Amendment is a prioritization of African American voting rights over women's suffrage. And so some members of the women's suffrage movement react against it. There's a great backlash. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony break from their allies in the Republican Party and in the African American community and push hard for women's suffrage. And so we see there just sort of a fracture of that coalition between African Americans and many white women suffragists during that period. And it would take a while to heal those wounds. Ultimately, what we'd see is that the 19th Amendment is ratified in 1920, which provides for equal women's suffrage. But you're right, Curry, it didn't solve every problem. Because if you're a woman of color, you're still dealing with the same sorts of voter suppression that African American men were. And so it would take decades upon decades of advocacy, especially through the civil rights movement, to push and ensure that that promise of the 19th Amendment of all women being given the right to vote is actually realized in practice. Ultimately, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where we see African American men and African American women both finally getting the full promise of the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment written into law and enforced inside the courts.
So finally, really, the Congress doing what was in the 15th Amendment. So the extra parts, or one of the clauses or sections of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment says, hey, Congress, you have the power to enforce this. So now we see almost a really long time later, I can't do math today, Congress doing that with the Voting Rights Act. So I know we're running out of time really quickly, but let's talk about the Indian Citizenship Act. And Marcia had a really good question. So are the only people allowed to vote in the United States, do they have to be citizens?
Those are both great questions. So first I'll say just a beat on the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. This is an act where finally we grant all Native Americans US citizenship. And so why 1924? Well, part of it, you're right, Curry, is like we've seen this series of progressive amendments which have altered elections and voting in the direction of greater democracy, including the Women's Suffrage Amendment, ratified in 1920. But also we saw Native Americans fighting in World War I on behalf of the United States. And so another theme we see in these amendments is that over time, as different groups have proven their courage on the battlefield, they've gotten more and more rights, including the right to vote. That was true of the African Americans after African American soldiers served in the Civil War. It was true, frankly, of women's support for the war effort, even in World War I on the home front, helping with the 19th Amendment. And then finally, we saw it with the 26th Amendment and young people in the Vietnam War. So in this sense, Native Americans are similarly laying claim to citizenship, and with that would follow the right to vote. And so we get that with the Indian Citizenship Act. But in the end, there's no requirement that only citizens can have the right to vote, but that ends up being set, again, that's sort of a question that ends up being shaped by law over time. I have to say I'm not as familiar with sort of the specifics of how that's cashed out on the ground over time. But in terms of, we've really, through our walk through the Constitution earlier, given you sort of all of the areas in which there's actually rules set in place. But again, what that allows for is a lot of play in the joints for, especially state and local governments to define voting rules, but also for the federal government to step in areas where they're specifically empowered by these voting rights amendments to also shape rules in a variety of ways.
And I think that's a great lead into our wrap up about, there are a lot of cases around those local or state rulings around who can vote and how they can vote. And so voter ID has been a real hot debate, but a lot of our students were asking about faithless electors. So I know it's a big one, but I wanted to make sure, I promised I would ask the question, and there's so many cool court cases to talk about. But I also want to, Marcia, it was such a great question. I want you to look, and I'm going to do the same thing, at my local rules and see what are the rules for who can vote. And it also depends on which election. So there's certain elections that are more broad that everybody can vote and younger students can vote. So DC right now is fighting for a 16-year-old to vote, but the 16-year-old to vote wouldn't be all elections. It would be local elections, including their school board, because kids should have a voice and agency in their picking their school board. So Tom, real quick, talk about what are faithless electors and what's happening there.
Sure. So this is a case from a couple of years ago called Chiafalo versus Washington. And the question there is, so faithless electors are people who are elected to the Electoral College. they're appointed largely by slates that are associated with the party that won the particular race in that state. And so they're really pledged to support a particular candidate. And so the question is, do electors themselves have to follow through and vote for who they pledge for, or are they free agents? And so this ends up turning a bit on, on the one hand, how much power do states have to shape how electors have to vote in the Electoral College versus how much does the Constitution grant freedom to those electors once they've been appointed to the Electoral College? And so Schiaffolo versus Washington dealt with a couple of laws throughout the nation that arose out of the election of 2016 and the election of Donald Trump. There was a push by electors on the left to call on electors put in place by the Republican Party to break their pledge to Donald Trump and vote for someone else in the Electoral College. And some states had mechanisms in place to punish faithless electors who didn't follow through on their pledges. In one case, it was they could be fined. I think it was $1,000 or some sum like that if they broke their pledge. In another state, it was, no, we're going to throw out your vote and appoint someone different if you don't vote the right way. And so the Supreme Court had to ask the question of whether or not states had the power under Article 2 to punish faithless electors. And as a result, really make sure there's a close link between the popular vote and how the electors vote in the Electoral College. And in the end, a unanimous Supreme Court upheld these laws in the states. Effectively, what the Supreme Court said is that Article 2 grants great discretion to the states to set the rules for their electors. Part of that is to allow them to punish faithless electors who do not follow through on the candidate they say that they are pledged to support. In that sense, really limiting the discretion, the freedom of electors once they're in the Electoral College, and giving a great deal of power to the states to set the rules of how electors are going to go about their tasks. So in the end, it's a validation of broad state power over the conduct of electors within the Electoral College.
And that's awesome, because I did not know they could throw out the vote. I knew that there were fines, because I think that was the main point of that case, that they fined somebody. But I always thought if somebody really wanted to do it and they had backing from the other party, they would pay their fine. So I think throwing out a person's vote, it has a real impact on the outcome.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing to remember is that, again, those rules, because in the end, what the Supreme Court does is it leaves it to federalism. It leaves it to state discretion, and so some states will have these punishments, many states do not. And again, those rules will be set state by state based on how the states want to sort of execute the Electoral College over time.
And great questions about spelling of all these cases. They're really awkward spellings. I will send everybody the list of these 3 cases that we talked about today and a link to them. Tom, are any of these in the Founders Library? I assume maybe not the 2 that are up right now, but the faithless electors case, is that in the Founders Library?
No, it's not.
Okay, no big deal.
But there are some really big voting cases in the Founders Library, though. Cases like Shelby County versus Holder, which had to do with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its pre-clearance requirement. South Carolina versus Katzenbach, which was older, that's from 1966 and had to do with the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. And so there are a lot of cases inside our Founders Library where you can look at those cases, get some background information, and then read the excerpts of what the justices had to say in those cases and really decide for yourself who you think got the debates right in these various constitutional issues.
Awesome. So we'll send a whole fun homework list of everybody to read, including the ones in the Founders Library. And the Voting Rights Act is coming to the Founders Library soon, isn't it?
It should be, yes.
Awesome. I love how you answer that. Very awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. This is a great class. We got through a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to stop the recording. Okay, and let's see if we have any more. You are welcome. Yes, these cases are sometimes people's names, so they tend to be hard things to hear the spelling over a Zoom. But Tom, that was fantastic, really helpful. And I will send everybody the lineup at the end of today. Let's be honest.